Okay. I can't follow instructions very well, but I'm glad that John gave me the latitude to change things around a little bit. I will get to the Peru system. In fact, it's pretty much all about the Peru upwelling system. I just came back from spending a couple weeks there, as a matter of fact, and some of the things come out of that. I think most of you know of a seminal paper that John Ryder wrote in 1969. It was titled Photosynthesis and Fish Production in the Sea. And I'll try to revisit that. And Ryder wrote in that paper that there was two sets of variables: primary production, food web dynamics that produce differences in fish production, which are much more pronounced than the observed variability in primary production itself. And that this paper was written after Ryder visited Peru in 1966, and he measured C14 primary production, and it wasn't that different from the measurements that he'd made in Woods Hole. But they were hauling out bucketfuls of sardines, and so he thought, you know, something's different here. And that led him to write that seminal paper in 1969. And essentially what Ryder suggested there was that the length of the food chain had a lot to do with how much fish you produced, and in a short coastal upwelling system, and Ryder conceived algae actually going directly to anchovies. Today we know that actually most of the energy comes in this direction, but either way, that food chain is a lot shorter, and he envisioned 1.5 steps there. And in the open ocean, this is the classical microbial food web, there are many more steps. Ryder had an intermediate coastal system. What he didn't know was that Peru was exceptional even within the coastal upwelling systems. And if you plot the quantity of primary productivity on this axis, and then the fish catch on this axis, but on a log axis, you see that Peru produces about an order of magnitude more fish per unit of primary productivity than any other ecosystem, any other coastal upwelling ecosystem. And I would guess that probably Ryder would never have written that 69 paper if he had gone to Benguela or California or some other place. I've tried to convert these numbers directly to grams. We were talking about conversions, and this is a typical, if it's a two-step food chain, would be about a 10% reduction per food step, and so it goes from about 10 to 10. There's going to be another graph that's like this that has so why does Peru produce more fish than the other upwelling ecosystem? Come on, guys, give me a little laugh. It's funny because, you know, I'm from Peru. We're a lot better fishermen than other parts of the world. Well, it's not quite so. There was another paper in 1988, when what was surprising to me about this paper by Nixon was that he doesn't even mention Ryder's paper. But he makes a comparison between marine fisheries and fisheries from lakes. And he concludes the same thing, that does not seem to reflect a general difference in primary production. Rather, the efficiency of conversion of photosynthetically fixed carbon to fish seems to be about 5 to 10 times higher in marine ecosystems than in lake ecosystems. And then it also appears to increase with increasing primary production. And he has this nice plot of fisheries landings. This is now in kilograms, which is wet weight, I assume, per hectare per year. And so this transfer actually changes as you go up this line. And I actually plotted Peru up here, which again is off the scale. The other upwelling systems seem to fall on this line if I've done the conversions correctly, although California may be a little higher along there. Okay, so now I'm going to what John asked me to do and talk a little bit about the coastal upwelling systems in general in Peru in particular, and I'll return to why I think Peru produces so much more fish than the other ecosystems. This is from a cover of a special issue in Progress in Oceanography. I realized I made a mistake when I made this cover. I was born right up here off the map in a little town called Talara. I came back to do my PhD work off of a little town called Paita. I put this in for our Chilean friends, just so they remember where Pisco comes from. Anyway, this is a picture of coastal upwelling in the southern hemisphere. Southwesterly winds bring water from subsurface. There's a lot of little details in this picture, like the wind speed actually increases as you go offshore. That generates another type of upwelling associated with the curl of the wind stress, and some argue makes the difference between certain ecosystems developing versus others. The coastal upwelling driven upwelling comes very close to shore and has some attributes that I'll get to later. The wind-driven curl is shallower and maybe more oceanic in nature. Typically, the nearshore waters dominated by diatoms, offshore waters dominated by a small picoplankton. We have a very shallow oxygen minimum zone, which plays an important role. And in particular, I'll come back to some of these issues throughout the talk. The coastal upwelling process has a lot of spatial variability associated with it at many different scales. The strongest upwelling, which Barber and Dugdale and others studied intensely in the 70s, is around 15 south. The big fishery and the highest primary productivity is actually in the shadow up north of that. So the upwelling plumes come off here, and then there are a series of other plumes, but this is, in general, I describe as a relatively large shadow where most of the fish production takes place. What is a coastal upwelling ecosystem? Some people refer to them as eastern boundary upwelling systems. They're a little bit different. The eastern boundary upwelling system reflects the large-scale dynamics. The coastal upwelling process itself is inherently mesoscale. These are actually words from Dick Barber, a mid to low latitude wind-driven circulation system that supports very high rates of new and export, and I've added both vertically and to the food web primary productivity. How is this high PP maintained? It is a circulation that creates an optimal environment for phytoplankton. High nutrients in a stratified water column. The upwelling comes up, heating stratifies slightly, and you have the optimal in terms of nutrient concentrations and light environment with a very shallow mixed layer. High is the high export to food webs maintained, high PP, larger organisms, short food veins, and enhanced transfer efficiency. And what limits this on a global scale is the relatively small size. There are 4 major eastern boundary coastal upwelling systems off of California, off of Northwest Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, off of Benguela, and off Peru and Chile. Each are associated with a high pressure system that causes a anticyclonic flow around them and generate essentially the trade wind fields associated with them, and either an equatorward winds that cause the coastal upwelling process. These winds cause a couple of other things to occur. One is the subtropical gyres, shown here in dynamic topography. The current systems associated with the western boundaries are fast, as seen by all of these lines being close together, while the eastern boundary currents are relatively slow and steady. This is another depiction of the same wind cartoon showing the steady trades that drive this circulation. They also drive an asymmetry between eastern and western basins. Water is piled up in the western basins, deepening the thermocline, and the thermocline is brought up closer to the eastern. The circulation leaves imprints in the depth of the nutricline and in productivity. So the two elements required for this enhanced productivity along the coastal upwelling ecosystems: an elevated thermocline, and more importantly a nutricline, and this is a basin scale process, and then this coastal upwelling, which is more of a local and mesoscale process. Sorry about the typo. East-west doming of the nutricline is supposed to be east. If we look at a section of nitrate from the western Pacific to the eastern Pacific, we see that the high concentrations of nitrate in the western Pacific are about a couple hundred meters, while they're very close to the surface in the eastern Pacific. There's also the a doming associated with the gyrocirculation. These are sections made about 1,000 kilometers from the coast, from Alaska to Chile. 3 panels: nitrate, oxygen, and nitrate deficit. Nitrate deficit calculated relative to Redfield. So these areas essentially have excess phosphate, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But there is a doming of this tropical area associated with the gyrocirculation process in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. And you see then that Peru has a much shallower nutricline than California, for example. These areas also tend to be shadows, and areas where the biological pump has more time to act, and they are typically associated with oxygen minimum zones, especially in the tropics. And when oxygen is consumed, nitrate becomes the electron donor, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. As I said at the beginning, the spatial variability in the coastal upwelling process occurs over many scales. At the basin scale, these coastal upwelling systems are shadow regions, especially at low latitudes, where nutrients tend to accumulate, and I'll show you that, and oxygen is consumed. Then, on the regional scale, each coastal upwelling system may be composed of several domains. For example, off here, off of the Pacific Northwest, we have a type of biome. In Central California, we have a type of biome. The Southern California Bight, big shadow biome. And then Baja. All these ecosystems are a little different from each other. And then the coastal upwelling process itself, which was studied in detail by Dugdale and Barber, is also inherently has its own scales of variability. I'm going to take you on a tour of a lot of different places as part of this, but we have a day and a half to sort of...
I like that first line though.
Again, I guess, I'm assuming most of you know this, the ocean is like a big plant. At the surface it removes CO2, and in the interior it consumes oxygen to degrade that CO2 into some form of energy. And this is, if you take the entire data sets from the World Ocean Atlas and other carbon type data sets, and you calculate a mean profile, this is what that mean profile for the world looks like. And oxygen is high at the surface, CO2 is low at the surface, and so is nitrate. and then both of those increase as material sinks and is degraded, and oxygen is consumed. Oh, I'm missing a little graph there. Huh. I wonder if it'll come in. Oh, well. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. And oxygen and nitrate, for example, are pretty linearly related. And here I put the mean concentration of nitrate in the world ocean. And if we didn't have any biology, then the atmosphere would be, of course, much higher than what we have today. If we dissect the world, then, in terms of nitrate, and it would be the inverse in terms of oxygen, and we take these nice data sets the World Ocean Atlas has given them, and we cut across the world, and so this is land, there's the Pacific, North America, and the Atlantic, and then there's a series of these cuts as we travel down the world. And of course, the Atlantic, because it's a younger ocean, has a lot less nitrate in it and a lot more oxygen. And the Pacific, and the North Pacific in particular, is the oldest water and it has a lot of nitrate and not that much oxygen in it. But what I want you to see as we go down here is the development of these high nitrate pools underneath the coastal upwelling ecosystems because of the shadow activity that occurs. And then when you get, because they get to be so shadowy, these areas start to lose nitrate because all of the oxygen has been consumed there. And as we go down further, and this is at 15 South, you can see in particular that there is this enhancement of nutrient under the Peru upwelling system as there is under some of the other upwelling systems too. And this is the picture that develops in this areas in terms of oxygen and these shadow areas, because the circulation pattern is something like this in the gyres. These areas are shadowed from that circulation process and therefore tend to become what we know as oxygen minimum zones. And in Peru in particular, this oxygen minimum zone is very enhanced and very shallow, and it almost breaks the surface in some of these areas. Here's the picture of these different biomes latitudinally. We typically tend to have what my fishery friends call a very good, a particularly productive habitat for these organisms. And around them live the predators, or the larger predators. There are some resident species that also predate on these organisms. And I realized, when I was teaching this class, that I made a mistake in this drawing, and that these arrows should be in this direction. The seabirds aren't feeding the plankton, although you could be through guano and fertilizer. If we look at these systems, and as I already described, there are these regional differences, you know, the Pacific Northwest. And what I'm going to do here is now compare all of these areas to each other in terms of productivity. And you can see that this area here lights up significantly relative to these other areas, which is where most of the fish is produced. And if you look at the comparison between these areas, then that area off of northern Peru is much higher in terms of productivity than any of the other areas that we've looked at. I realized I didn't have a very good picture of a mesoscale. I didn't have a very good mesoscale picture for Peru. And given some time, I think I'll develop one. But I'll use one from my day job, which is working at Imbari and maintaining a time series in the Monterey Bay area. So I want you to focus on these two panels on the right, and the one on the top is temperature. And again, the more active upwelling areas tend to be associated with capes, and in this case, Año Nuevo tends to be our main location of cold water. and then there are shadows in back of those. This is a relatively weak upwelling system with the, so to speak. But along this axis of cold water, chlorophyll is actually lower than in the surrounding waters, because the phytoplankton that's coming to the surface is coming from deep and is quite diluted. That picture is shown here in a cartoon form, with this coastal upwelling area being an area of lower phytoplankton, and then phytoplankton developing as they become in contact with sun. If you took an image of a coastal upwelling center, it would look something like this, with not many things in it, all of them rather small, and maybe a material that's come off the bottom. After a few days downstream, we would find many things like this, ketosiferous centric diatoms. Same thing in the equator, and when you add some iron, perhaps. And if you took and you plotted a series of data that we've collected in different parts of the world together, and you plotted chlorophyll against the concentration of diatoms, you get a nice positive relationship. And if you take the diatoms off and plot chlorophyll against the rest of the groups, you don't get any relationship whatsoever here. So the diatoms, and maybe in some occasions, red tide organisms are the primary drivers.
So if you were to follow the evolution, we have several plumes that are persistent of the coast, really jets that go from upwelling into the open ocean. You would see the same successional pattern. You would expect to see small up and then evolving to large.
You would expect that.
Diatoms.
Yeah.
Has anybody looked at the follow-up of
Dick Dugdale and his colleagues have done this over and over again, right?
Which was that?
Deploy a drifter at the edge of the, and this is actually slide.
Okay.
Thank you for leading me into the.
I have to leave, so I have to ask a question before you.
You got 15 minutes.
No, I don't. I have to go to my room. Sorry.
I'm a little behind, I think, but bear with me. Actually, this picture came from Dick, and Dick suggests that the organisms that are underneath the upwelling plume are low light and high nutrients, and they're shifted down because of the low light. Should probably ask Dick to give this part of the presentation. As they come up, it takes them a little time to shift up. And as they advect offshore, they start to bloom, and large cells begin to dominate, and chlorophyll accumulates, and this is the optimal location. And then once they have consumed most of the nutrients, they shift down over time. And experiments with drogues in those areas show that this rate of nitrate uptake, which is a rate that has been normalized to particulate nitrogen, so it's essentially a growth rate, starts out slow at the beginning, and after a few days they shift up and they go into this rapid growth rate period, and after a few days they shift down because they've consumed most of their nitrate. Later, with the work of Bruland and others, and Johnson and others, we found that there was another element that was included in this nutrient process, and that was the source of iron from the continental shelves. And both Kens, Ken Johnson and Bruland, have made measurements in these boundary areas and showed that this source of iron drops off very rapidly as you go offshore. Peru has a number of peculiarities associated with them. One of them is that it's one of the only upwelling ecosystems where upwelling and productivity are inversely related. In California, strong upwelling, high productivity. In Peru, it's exactly the opposite. So I'm plotting nitrate over the course of the seasonal cycle as an indicator of upwelling, and then chlorophyll over time, and these are months. And you see that the July period, which is the period of strongest upwelling, happens to be the time of lowest productivity. And there are several thoughts about that. It's also associated with it. If you go to Peru in June and July, the coast is horrible. It's like our summer here. It's terribly foggy, and there's less light. But there's also a deeper mixed layer associated with this increased wind. And I won't get into the details of why, but iron could be at play with stronger curl. Peru is also sort of part of this general HNLC area associated with the equatorial Pacific. And this is the mean nitrate profile from the World Ocean Atlas, and you can see that at least that area has a lot of excess nitrate, and if we believe that we can measure iron limitation from space, as Mike Barrenfield does, that area may be somewhat iron limited. And over time, longer time, the Peru chlorophyll concentrations look like they're increasing, while the nitrate concentrations seem to be decreasing, as if oxygen is becoming lower, again giving credence to other processes regulating productivity. You getting ready to throw me off the...
Yeah, we're working on getting ready.
Sorry, I still have a couple of other things, but I think it'll be worth it for discussion of the rest of the week. So there has been this greening that extends from Monterey Bay all the way to Peru, and Jim will talk a little bit, I'm sure, about San Francisco Bay, which then leads me to why the reasons for this high fish productions. So one of them is the weak winds in this shadow area, which sort of give an optimal condition for productivity and for fish. The fish need to be where the productivity is. If you have strong winds, you decouple the food from the predator. It's also the area with the most extreme climate variability in the globe. And maybe that does something to keep the ecosystem out of a sync. There always are growers. The fast growers are able to get away because the predators never establish themselves. And the last one, which I think may be the most important one, is because the low oxygen concentrates pay and keeps the predators out. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly since I know John. So if you just do a variability picture of the world, this is the first mode that comes out. And Peru is the strongest area of variability. And then there are these, if you look at it in decadal scales, you find that there are these regime shifts, and one of them that just happened recently that's turned this general area into a cool anomaly. And associated with those changes in one of the decadal scales are changes in the abundance of certain fish. And you go from anchovies to sardines, back to anchovies, and notice the difference in scales. There's about 5 times more anchovies than there are sardines. And there's this coherence between these changes in Peru and, for example, Japan. Today, you can hardly find a single sardine in Japan or Peru. And during these periods of warming, the area gets more oxygenated, and during other periods, it gets less oxygenated, in particular the anchovy period. And I don't want to get into this detail because, as I said, I'm already way behind, but if you look into the sediments, this same story occurs. During the Little Ice Age, when the world was colder, the area around Peru gets oxygenated. Hardly any fish remains in the sediments. And it's this recent period with low oxygen that leads to a period of increased productivity. And in California, where we have a deep oxygen minimum, the zooplankton migrate to great depths on a day-to-night cycle to escape predation. But they're not able to do that in a very shallow environment, and so you're effectively concentrating the prey of these fish and therefore enhancing the transfer efficiency. You're also keeping out big fish that need a big habitat like tuna that might prey on them outside of that area. So, thank you for putting up with me. A conclusion, the coastal upwelling is a circulation pattern that results in optimal light and nutrients. They vary at many spatial scales. The mesoscale patterns are complex, but as Ricardo said before he left, there are certain areas where those features are always there, so they're anchored. The coastal upwelling feature off of Año Nuevo is always anchored there. So while it looks complex in a satellite image, they are recurrent. The high productivity is restricted within 100 kilometers of the coast, most likely by iron, and Dick Dugdale will probably say silicate as well. The high fish production is associated with short food chain. Peru produces more fish, and this high fish production is driven by those three factors. I'm sorry for taking longer than I was allocated. I will pass on the questions.
We tricked you because we're actually bad on schedule.
Okay.
So there's a lot of food for thought
Yeah.
there.
I gave you, as I said, a potpourri of things that we can chat about over the.
So one of the things that occurs to me in the context, you described all these different features of upwelling systems, and which I think maybe later we could talk about what the properties would be of an enhanced system or an artificial system. But what do you think the minimal, in order to couple the fish production, what do you think the minimal system is? So in other words, what's the smallest upwelling zone that you know of where there's actually something that's considered a productive area, but it's a small upwelling zone? In other words, how do you scale natural upwelling zones and the link to fish production? Like the Peru system is big. We always talk about the Peru system.
Well, it's not necessarily that big. Remember what I said was, you need upwelling, but not very strong upwelling. So you want to keep the sources and sinks as close together as you can to enhance transfer. So, and where would you put that in the world? Is that you're asking? Is there a place in the world where you can set that up?
It's a second order question with need from that. But what would be the scale of an upwelling process? Because you said you need this sort of shadow zone where it's really the fish production.
Well, if you were going to create an artificial upwelling area, I think the question is what would the size of that be?
Right.
And one is you need persistence. So it's not only the size but the time. So I would think you would need something on the order of, and I want to say between 10 and 100 kilometers squared, and you need to have it over the course of years. Because there's two things that will happen, and things that happen during when we've done artificial upwelling experiments by adding iron, for example. One is the first thing you do is you attract things. So that first response is just an attractive response. You're not really making new biomass. Maybe you're fattening up the existing biomass. But if you want to grow things from scratch, then you need, and the time of, I don't know what a menhaden is, but an anchovy reproduces it once a year or so. So it's very rapid. But how do you? I mean, there's a whole slew of engineering thoughts that you have. Do you seed it with small fish? How do you do that? That whole process of going from upwelling to fish. There's a whole slew of things that you need to consider. And I'm not sure, you may be prepared to talk about that more later, but I haven't really thought about
Maybe
that.
in the next workshop.
Let's see, I got a couple questions over here.
Well, I was interested in the comment that the strong winds decouple the predators from the prey, and that could exactly be how it is. I've always thought of it as the weak winds allow for solar insulation to shallow the thermocline, creating more intense productivity. So I thought about it more from a bottom-up sense.
Well, if the fisheries, have you heard of the optimal environmental window? Bakken and others, yeah, they plot wind speed against recruitment success in an upwelling area, and the maximum recruitment success is mid. So you keep, if it's too weak, you don't get enough productivity. You don't get, if it's too, the beauty of Peru, because it's low latitude, is even with relatively weak winds, you get a broad and quantitatively you upwell a lot of nitrate. And so you get an optimum. If it's too fast, yeah, it's like your recruitment. Mark would know this very well. Recruitment of intertidal organisms. You need the relaxation phases.
Yeah, I'm not saying you don't need those. I'm just thinking about the process. What you described as top down, whereas I thought of it as bottom up. So Mark is nodding his head over here, saying, yeah, it's a dispersion of the predators.
It's both, I think. Yeah, I think it's both. It's a top down and a bottom up effect. But there is this decoupling of when off California, it's actually in the strong upwelling periods, things are very dispersed. It isn't until things relax that you get a lot of accumulation of krill and you get whales come in. And fish are more interested in concentration than they are in productivity. Are you going to ask a question?
Here we go first. I wanted to know something
Well,
about States.
I was sort of following up on what John was asking, which was asking about sort of a horizontal space. How big does it have to be horizontally? But there's also, what I heard from your talk was that there's this vertical structure that's very important as well,
Yes.
which has to do with sort of concentrating, not letting those zooplankton go deep.
Two things. Yeah, two things. It has to do with mixed layers and a concentrating prey.
Right.
Now, one thing, the Peru is abnormal, right? With side and there still is a concentrating process, a food web process that occurs independent. If we take Peru out of the picture, the line that Nixon plotted keeps increasing in efficiency as you go up it. So I just don't want to just, you do a lot better when you concentrate by this oxygen minimum process, but you still have an enhanced productivity relative to lower productivities in terms of transfer efficiency without it. But the mixed layer and the surface layer is an important vertical dimension.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about that from an artificial system.
Yeah.
And the complications that raises for an artificial system. With a artificial, you could imagine, I don't know how you do it, but engineers could figure out how to do it on a larger scale, but I'm not sure how you how you control this vertical processes.
You have to find it, I mean,
You just have to use.
the Southern Ocean would be a bad place to do this.
Right.
Be careful, or this will be deoxygenating the world's oceans.
Yeah, right. Right, so that's dependent on
Yeah.
site selection.
Exactly. I think.
Right, that's not
Yeah.
something you can engineer.
Yeah, unless you wanted to, change solar installations or.
Francisco, the thing that impresses you in Peru, at least it did me, and that was that the fish tend to be where the phytoplankton are. And that comes back to what you're saying. It's that somehow the physics is just right in that area for the ecosystem to function almost optimally. And the thing I'm happy to hear about this is that people believe that fish eat phytoplankton, and that was not accepted by the fisheries people for many, many years, actually, when it comes down to it. But the Peruvians told us when we first went down there that the anchovies are eating zooplankton. So we cut open the first one we caught, and they're full of diatoms, actually. So they are feeding a lot of the time directly on the diatoms when you get the high diatom.
Yeah,
Could you tell whether they were digesting?
Except that when they went back and they took, so yeah, numerically they're dominated. If you look at a numerical analysis of stomach contents, the diatoms or the phytoplankton dominate. But if you take all of those cells and you do a caloric equivalent, then they're still they're primarily getting most of their calories from the zooplankton. That's what the recent analysis and it seems to be similar, confirmed from different upwelling uses. However, it doesn't mean that they're not getting some important things from the phytoplankton that make them special. But according to the analysis that the fish gut people have done, they still estimate that 90% of their calories are coming from zooplankton.
And do they have the ability to digest? Because one of the things that startled us was, in the algae business, it is known that humans do not have the enzymes you need to digest chlorella, which does not stop a huge number of people on the planet from buying and eating chlorella.
Well, that's why they do it, right? So they can clean their systems up.
But the other thing that the anchovies do there is that they're recycling nutrients.
Mhm.
And you can follow it, you can follow the school of anchovies, so to speak, from the creatine that they're excreting. So they're really a very close part of the whole nutrient circulation machine down there.
Yeah, and the cosine model is predicting a pretty big plume. Of course, it doesn't have anchovies in it, but it's the zooplankton. A lot of ammonia it predicted along.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And Terry Whitlish did a budget for that, I remember, quite a long time ago. The other thing you didn't mention, and that is the concentrating effect of the coast of the undercurrent.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And
That's a big
there's
thing.
lots of things that I didn't mention, Dick. Well, it was one of them.
But that's an important one.
Well, because if I can just go back, the one. Go ahead and ask questions. See if I can.
I just want to make two comments, both from the Pacific Northwest. And you mentioned you can't just attract predators, you have to kind of build it up. And I think the cold anomaly off Oregon was a good example of unusually high primary productivity leading to anoxia in the benthic environment because there weren't any predators fast enough. And so you could stimulate an artificial upwelling, and if you don't have the predators there, you just made things worse. But in Ginger's comment, I was reminded that Bill Peterson has been arguing that the canyons actually enhance trophic transfer in the Pacific Northwest. Because with relatively low primary productivity, the copepods and euphausians come up in the canyons, get trapped over the shelf, and then they get stuck there and the salmon eat them. And so it's a nice way of condensing down the vertical by allowing the predators to come up and then get stuck in a shallow environment.
Plus, they hide in the canyons too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they don't have to be offshore, away from the But one thing I didn't mention here, in Dick's, because and there's a two-dimensional conveyor belt essentially. Dick was mentioning the thought that the system is actually as the phytoplankton get offshore, they may change their buoyancy in some form or another, sink, and then get caught back in. And the same thing is happening alongshore, because most of the flow close to shore is actually happening against the wind. Only a shallow layer on the surface is going with the wind, and most of it is going, in this case, well, all cases, from the poleward. And so there would be a similar recycling loop in this dimension. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about, you say there was a lot of zooplankton in the anchovies. In other words, a lot of the biomass in their stomach. Were those
I said that that if you count and you do a caloric, I don't know how many of them there were, but they were their primary energy source.
Right.
And they're mainly krill, small krill.
Oh,
and,
yeah, I was going to ask about
Yeah.
the response time. Are they, in other words, are they getting to that age within a week or so, or are they?
I could probably find out the answer to that, but I don't have it off the tip of my tongue. Yeah, small. Yeah, but they are. The krill are a critical a component of the ecosystem in Peru and here locally too, of course.
Yeah.
Did you want to say some more?
No, it's just that the response time I would think would be so long. I'm really surprised that it would be krill rather than protozoans, say.
Yeah, no, and that, was a good question, because I'm sure the protozoans were not identifiable in the gut.
Okay, because
So there could be a protozoan, but they still and I'm trying to think of how important protozoans are off of there. What we find here locally is that protozoans tend to be reduced relative to an offshore area. If we make a transect off from here to Hawaii, the protozoans actually show a minimum inshore.
Because it's just the response.
Yeah.
It baffles me why that should be.
Well, remember too that the spatial, this upwelling system, and if think of it in a bigger sense, there are things that are sitting at the sides that already are spun up, I think, and that they're coming in. And so this mesoscale process that surrounds the upwelling plumes that we actually don't know that much about it.
Francisco, one of the important things that you said is that the key to high primary production in upwelling systems is the combination of high nutrients in a stratified water column.
Yeah.
So this is a question.
I didn't say that. Barbara and Dugdale said that. I just repeated it. but I do believe it.
So my question for the group and others is, there are other places on the planet that have that combination, high nutrients and stratified water column. So for example, I'm thinking about estuaries like San Francisco Bay and Chesapeake Bay, maybe Puget Sound, where you have episodic stratification in an environment that has high nutrients. So the nutrients come from land runoff, and the stratification sometimes from river coastline water, stratified water column. So have you thought about, as a group, have you thought about other combinations on the planet where that promotes fast, high primary production, usually dichome production? Or do you want to specifically focus on upwelling systems?
All right. I'll answer. I don't think they care where it is, right?
No, we don't.
And in terms of John's question, I can imagine it, especially in a development phase, an experimental development phase, maybe taking advantage of one of these systems. It's free. And the neat thing about it is that they're pretty recurrent in terms of their timing. So we know within weeks when the spring dichome blooms are developed in San Francisco Bay. So it's just something to think about is maybe not just be absolutely focused on.
No, I think I'll make an assumption. I think we're looking at the upwelling systems to see, or there's interest in looking at the upwelling systems to see how they function because of this thought that they produce so much fish. And I was just trying to call attention to what some of the processes that lead to that high fish production, in particular off Peru, which is this anomaly. Sorry, the one thing that I thought that I don't know how to explain because I really just started looking at it and I don't understand very well is this difference between marine and lake systems. Which I wonder if there's some relation to something happening in a place like an estuary. What would control fish production in a lake relative to an ocean at the same productivity levels? And the only thing I can think of is that it's so contained that there's some food web process that is, you know, that you need a larger area to complete that transfer. I don't, I'm a little baffled. I just found this paper recently, or just found the this comment in that paper that says, yeah, lakes for the same productivity produce a lot less fish.
I've always thought that it was a difference in the quality of phytoplankton as a food resource.
Yeah, that's probably it.
There may be some additional links there too.
Yeah, it's probably not just one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like rotifers, for example.
Mark.
You know, your response to John's question had really important implications, I think, for what your objectives are and how you manage for that. So you could have a relatively small scale of upwelling phenomenon that, like you said, is actually attracting the predators. And in doing so, you could increase the efficiency of harvest for those predators, right? There's two ways to crank up food production. One is you crank up the overall production. The other is you crank up the efficiency of harvest. And so that smaller scale upwelling could actually lead to enhancing the efficiency of the harvest, with the caveat though that you said, which is that the overall production of the stock is actually based on lower production around more region, right?
Yeah. Two things. I was wondering if you could go back to the slide where you had fish production and it was like high anchovies and then sardines.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think you just passed it.
No, I don't think so. Coming.
Yeah, okay. So there are upwelling events off of California, but the fish production is low.
Relatively speaking, yeah. Well, we also saw that, you know, in the first graph that I showed, where I showed the productivity versus fish, you know, there's a lot less fish now. If we were going to go back far enough, and I think what I did for that plot, I think I took the catches back here. So if you go back, so California has never recovered from the anchovy, from the collapse of the sardines. If you go back here, the sardines' demise is right around here with this change in regime. When we go to a colder regime, the sardines tend to be associated with colder regimes in California and Peru. So it never recovers to the levels it was back here. And it was quite a bit higher back here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, all right.
And so Mexico does a little something like that, but California seems to be a little different. But this multi-decadal variability does show up in a whole bunch of different places. If you go back in time and you plotted the California regime, it plots very well with like the sardines in Japan as well back here.
Okay. So yeah, my question was,
Yeah.
was just looking at that graph.
Yeah.
Does that mean only?
I just happen to have this one. I probably would, if I had to present this again, I wouldn't put the California one because it would distract you from, make you ask that question.
Yeah. No, I just wanted, does that mean it's just not a matter of getting deeper water any place and bringing it up?
Yeah, I mean, I asked Steve this question. I think it was asked you. I never know how many sardines we really have in California. Off Peru, they know exactly how many anchovies and sardines they have because they have this incredible monitoring capability because it's so much more important economically than it is to us here.
So the whole issue of I think it was either John or Lisa showed a slide of what they're going to do in Hawaii with the tubes coming up and using water to cool. I'm just wondering, based on this and what you're saying, so, you know, just because you're doing it there doesn't mean that you could actually get more fish production there. Whereas what's being talked about in general is there something about the bigger ecosystem scale versus a much smaller engineering scale.
It's a really interesting question. If you were going to do this off of Hawaii, for example, you expect that at least seasonally you would stratify. You know, over what time scale would you need to carry out that process to actually, you know, and then you start thinking about, as I said, engineering things. Do you seed with this or with that, or you could imagine. I'm not saying you should do that. I said you could imagine how you could take an area that was, you know, where you were bringing up nutrients from deep. I would think that, and I don't know if Ken would agree with that, you would probably have to add a little extra iron because because you would quickly become iron limited.
So just one more follow-up question. So are the models for fish production good enough to test these things?
My honest opinion is that they're not, but other fisheries folks might differ.
I don't think I would disagree with your assessment.
Francisco, I'm having trouble swallowing this idea that the anchovies off Peru, for example, are getting most of their calories from zooplankton. So
I'm only telling you what I, you know, I'm only telling you what I, you know.
Okay, but
I always tell people, don't believe what you read.
I want to ask you this, because his major professor was fond of saying when these things don't seem to work out, he would say, it sounds like these organisms evolved in nature. So I'm asking.
But I think just you can have your cake and eat it too. I mean, go ahead.
I'll ask you the question. If you watch anchovies feeding, for example, in the aquarium at San Francisco, you watch them open their mouth when they're filter feeding, and it's really hard work. Why would you develop that kind of a system if you're only going to get 10% of your calories from that kind of
if you put a whole bunch of artemia in there, you will see them.
Also, yes.
Yeah.
But
and their gill rakers are pretty wide, and it's kind of counterintuitive because the sardine, which is a bigger fish, has much finer gill rakers, and we think that most of their, you know, the paper that was just published in PLOS One goes through that energy balance for those two fish.
But if you look at them, when they open up,
I
they have to work really hard to do that. There's a big cost for that.
Exactly.
So why would they do that if they're only getting 10% of their
because
calories
in
from
nature
that?
they don't do that most of the time. I think that would be the answer. That most of the time they're actually pecking. That's the dogma.
Okay, gentlemen,
Oh, boy.
I didn't take us outside.
I'm with you there. I mean, you know,
Applying your major professor's criteria, I have a problem with it.
and yeah, that's what science is all about.
So I can see I still haven't scheduled enough discussion time in this meeting, but hopefully